I want to kind of take us through this map one by one and explain my thought process when I saw this game live. When I saw this game live, if we take a look at the maps here, Oasis, the San Francisco Shock were trying to run the Sombra Reaper kind of compositions, and their coordination, in my opinion, was very poor. Then on Kings Row, I think the San Francisco Shock tried to mirror the Hog Zarya, right? But they had Smurf on Zarya, something like that. I can't exactly remember, but yeah. That was another absolute tragic stomping for the Washington Justice. Volskaya Industries is where the Shock brought them to, which I think is a really smart decision, where they used the Ants Ash and the Mercy's End backline to completely pound the Washington Justice. This map was a really good understanding of how to counter Hog Zarya on certain maps. Watchpoint Gibraltar, my favorite map of this series. I thought, what in the fucking Lord's name are the Washington Justice doing, taking them to Watchpoint Gibraltar when Washington are going to be playing Hog Zarya? It's full of high ground. Why on earth are you playing Hog Zarya? But as I'll go through on that map, they had some great ideas of how to push with the Hog Zarya. And then on Lijiang Tower, the San Francisco Shock brought in the finisher Super to mirror the Hog Zarya and also play some Rush, which I thought was a great idea. But these first two maps are more so really bad gameplay by the Shock, because the Washington Justice were pretty consistent throughout this series, you know? They were good, they were dangerous, they were difficult to beat. But in the first two maps, they just got handed map wins, and then in the last three, the Shock... Well, actually, the middle map, Volskaya, was very bad for the Justice. But once the Justice started picking maps, because the Hog Zarya comp is very map dependent, as soon as they started picking maps, they made the series much closer. Moth is in. Why? Because they want to run Rush comps or the Lucio-esque comps. So anytime you want to run the Reaper and then the Sombra, you're going to want to run Moth because you need the Lucio for that comp. Now, I would say, I mean, I have no idea why Striker went over to the Mei there. I would say that the San Francisco Shock came into this match expecting for this composition to be the best in the league. It's what Philly were running. It's what Mayhem were running. The Valiant started running it as well in that last week. This comp, in theory, booms this comp. But you have to play it perfectly for it to be a counter comp. Yeah, coordination has to be fantastic. And the Washington Justice can still clutch because Janu can hit a hook, Stitch can hit a headshot, Decay can just go Decay mode sometimes as well. Or, you know, occasionally there can be like a clutch sleep dart or something as well, or a Bionade. So the Washington Justice have got a lot to mess up even the best counter comp that you can throw at it. The best counter to the Hog Zarya is honestly just clever map selection, honestly. So they try and dive into the back. They get a good engagement, kill the back line, keep the tanks alive for a bit. They still lose players, though, on this push. And they're trying to get out of here. They've kept their players alive. They're going to be able to capture the point. That was a pretty nice example of the San Francisco Shock utilizing their dive engage onto the back line to counter the Washington Justice. That's all good. That's really good. They've got to play as fast as they possibly can to blow up the Washington Justice before they can get value over time. So I enjoy that. That worked really well. Good play. This time they engage. They go for a very deep dive. They're trying to go into the back line immediately again. Take down Aim God instantly. Go back. Clean up the tanks. This is all good. You know, they just rolled them. And at this point in the series, you know, like 2 fights in, I'm thinking, wow, the Shock really know how to counter the Justice's composition. Justice are one-trick pony team that only have one style that they can play. And if you just play fast dive against them, you'll win every time. Right? It just makes sense. It all aligns with our theories and concepts of Overwatch. It all makes sense. Oh, yeah, I'm dono walling you guys. What's up? Brent, I'm down to play some Valorant afterwards. But I'm going to do this first. Do you think the Hog just flat out feeds too much ult in the no shield meta? No, I don't think that's even a factor. I don't know why people always bring up Hog feeding ult as a disadvantage to the hero. It is very, very rarely important in any sense. Across all the metas of Overwatch, I don't think there's been a single meta where people at the top level were like, we shouldn't feed Hog, we shouldn't play Hog because it feeds too much ult. It just never factors in. Alright, anyway. San Francisco, Smurf gets hacked. This is the team fight, I think, where the Shock fuck up. They just play way too safe. I don't really know what they're trying to do. I think they're trying to counter the EMP because they've been tracking Tuba's ult and they think he'll have it up. But they literally just give Washington Justice all the space and then Moth gets killed. And there wasn't a team fight there. There was no team fight there at all. And now Shock are forced to just try and commit, I guess, because they were caught in. And Rascal uses his EMP. This is horse shit. This is dreadful gameplay from the San Francisco Shock. This fight was awful. Scrub your eyes. What the fuck did Rascal use his EMP for there? That was absolutely terrible gameplay. Tell me Justice are going to win it all? No, I don't think so. But I do think that they are a super dangerous team and they could beat any team. I think they're... If Fusion lose to the Shock, I think there is a chance that the Justice make it to the Grand Finals. I think there's a chance. I think there is a chance. I have the script. They're going to win. Because if the Fusion lose to the San Francisco Shock, they're not going to have put in the prep to be able to beat the Washington Justice, I think. And if they lose to the Shock, the reason for that is probably because they haven't done the prep during the week itself. So, if Fusion loses to Shock, which shouldn't happen anyway, then Fusion are actually quite likely to lose to the Justice as well, I think. Anyway, so they're pushing back in with this engagement. And the Shock's composition, when you're pushing back in, it is very difficult to try and counter the ults that the Washington Justice get online. So this comp is hard to beat anyway. You have to run a composition like this. Well, you don't have to. There's other ways that the Shock ended up countering it as well. But in theory, most of the teams are going to run a comp like this. You get a hack onto Decay or Janu. You try and dive into them. You either shred the front line or try and take out Aim God or Stitch in the back line. You try and play super fast, super aggressive. But the Washington Justice at any point can get a hook. They can get a headshot. They can... get a Bionade that can fuck you up as well, and the ult cycling that they get up. Like, the only big ult that you really have available that is going to mess them up is the EMP. The other ults, I mean, Moth is going to be saving his sound barrier to be using defensively against Tuba. The Grav, you don't really have too much to deal with. Violet's Coalescence is good for being able to engage, but it can just get countered by the Bionade as well. There's so much individual clutch potential from the Washington Justice, and the ult cycling is pretty good as well. This comp is good. And I didn't expect to be saying that at the end of this week. So they engage with the Coalescence there at the beginning, but they just get EMP'd and grabbed. So that's a GG. Also, Rascal would love to have his EMP for the next fight, but he threw it away. He threw it away. Matty Beans, thanks for the 5 months. And C-Spars as well. Thank you for the sub. Why is Sombra Reaper Lucio Moira played more when people complain that the only viable are Animercy? I have no idea. I can't relate to you, David, because I've never heard anybody say to me that Animercy, Widow, or Ash McCree are the only viable heroes. Maybe in ranked because people don't have the coordination to be able to pull off like a Sombra dive comp. Sombra has pretty bad win rates at most levels of ranked, so... Hex and Jaws don't even realize that Rascal has used his EMP, because when he used his EMP, it made no sense. So there's no reason that a caster would even be looking out for Rascal using his EMP, because they had already lost the team fight when he invested it. What is this? What is this? Just a TP into the backlines from Striker, like so one-dimensional in terms of the dives that they're trying to do. Yeah, they're going on Stitch in the backlines, but you're trying to dive past everybody on the Washington Justice. The hack onto Janu, but they can't really engage onto him because Striker's dead, so they don't have the damage to be able to do anything. Nano onto Decay as well to be able to keep him alive, which I really like. Decay's weak. He's also been hacked, but people can't finish him off because he's playing really smart with his positioning and just backing all the way up. So they'll give the point to the San Francisco Shock here because they're so confident that they can just win the fight overall. Because the longer the fight goes, the better it is for Washington. Because they have more chance of getting headshots, more chance of getting hooks, more chance of getting big Bionades. Shock have to turn the tempo way up. Every time Rascal misuses an EMP, take a shot. I think I'd have liver failure by the end of map 1. How did Rascal use that previous EMP, by the way? I mean, I missed that one. What is this? Okay. So they've already lost Striker in this team fight. EMP gets used to kill... Oh no, Striker is already back in the fight, actually. And they've killed Aim God. But they're so spread out. Like, there's no position on the map that the San Francisco Shock have taken. You know, they haven't got an area. They are just inting towards the Washington Justice to try and get picks. The res comes onto Aim God, so they've just sacrificed all of their positioning to get a pick that gets resed anyway. It's just so bad from the Shock. It's a lot worse than what we see from a team like the Fusion or Shanghai, these kind of teams when they play in this comp. The coordination is just miles off. I think they just came into this game thinking, it's simple. We just dive their backline and ignore the Hog and the Zarya and then go back and kill them afterwards. But the Justice are putting their backline so far back that you can't dive them that easily, and it just takes too long. I feel like this match is similar to when Shock lost to Paris in that Rascal didn't seem comfortable on the Sombra and Shock don't have a 100% grasp on the meta yet. Shock looked better with Ants on the Sombra against Atlanta. Do you think they'll run Rascal or Ants Sombra in the future? I think they'll run Ants Sombra. I think Ants looks much better at the Sombra in these metas. I think he has done for actually quite a while. And it gives them the flexibility to be able to run Ashe Tracer compositions with the Zen Mercy if they need to. If they need to make that swap halfway through the map. I think they'll also take this week off to improve a lot. Because Shock, I think, just had a bad read on how to play these compositions. They didn't have a bad read on the meta in terms of not knowing which compositions to play, but they had a bad read on the meta in terms of like how the compositions interacted with each other. So that is just horrible gameplay from the San Francisco Shock. They were playing pretty well until they gave Justice control of the point, and then they just Papega clapped the rest of the way. Really poor coordination. What are your thoughts on Decay's Grav usage? I think it's been pretty good. I think a lot of the time you're playing against highly mobile comps where you just need to get like a single pick to be able to counter them. I thought it was pretty good. It's not, I mean, this sounds crazy as well, but the Grav isn't even that important in these team fights. It is on Assault if you want to close out a round win on attack or something like that. But most of what the Justice are doing is just their neutral game. You know, the hooks, the damage coming out from Decay, Stitch hidden headshots, that kind of stuff. The big ults that they have is EMP. And then the Grav Whole Hog is good for being able to clean up some team fights as well. But the Justice don't rely on the ults. If they can get like a decent Grav that kills a player and gives them an advantage in the team fight, they've basically won. One single pick is all you need to be able to break a dive comp that's trying to counter you. Okay, so anyway, let me wind back to the beginning of here. So the Shock are still running this Sombra Reaper. Still going to be trying to run aggressively into the Washington Justice. This map is a lot more tight choke points, which I think favors the dive teams as well. You have control over the high ground unless Decay and Jano take a long flank around to get up there. For Aim God and Stitch, they actually have to push in through choke points. So I think it makes it a lot easier for San Francisco Shock to counter this style. And this is why I don't think the Justice are actually going to make it all the way, is that this comp is really good. And not just this comp, but the variations of the comp that they run. The Pharah variation with Tuber on the Pharah. The Ashe variation that they're running currently. What other stuff do they run? They sometimes run Tuber on the Tracer as well, so they run an Ashe Tracer variation of it. These variations are pretty good. They're very good comps, actually. But they're very map dependent as well. I would expect them to lose Volskaya against any top team that they play against. I would expect them to lose multiple control maps against other teams running the kind of counter comp that San Francisco Shock are running at the moment. Because you just can't get your backline into position effectively. What the Washington Justice rely on is a gap between their front line and their back line, so that Decay and Jano are taking enough space in the front line to create a safe area for Stitch and Aim God to play in. But if Stitch and Aim God need to move past choke points in order to get value, then that just creates a natural blockage that they're not going to be able to back up past. Like, for example, here, unless Aim God can get positioned down long sight lines like this, when they've tried previously, when they were looping around the side, Aim God has to be in a claustrophobic area in order to get his healing out, as does Stitch, which just sets the dive team up perfectly to be able to collapse on them. Aim God is trying to play much further back at the moment, but it's hard for him to be able to find good sightlines. Like this engage is arguably a little too aggressive, not too aggressive, but a little too far forward from the Shock, but they still have the EMP, so it's still worth going for. But if that was just a dry engage without the EMP, they probably would have lost, because they're diving into the Roadhog and the Zarya instead of past the Roadhog and the Zarya. Now, you can still burst down the tank line running the Sombra and the Reaper, but you have to get a hack first. Like here at the beginning of this fight, when Jano gets rezzed, they're going onto the front line this time instead. The hack comes onto Arc, but really they're just body blocking Jano and booping him away. It's a sick play by Moth that isolates Jano from the rest of the team. But now they're going too deep. Like way too deep. Once you get that first pick, it is so not worth to just dive into their backlines. Choyobin finds a pick, and they manage to somehow get a kill on Decay, which I have no idea how they quite managed to get that kill. But there was a strong likelihood there that the Shock are about to feed. Because they're pushing into a nano-boosted Decay, and the Washington Justice have their Ana and their Ashe set up on good sightlines. Fucking Dono Wall, here we go. Usually we praise Shock for their teamwork and coordination. Why do you think they played so Papega in the first two maps? If we didn't see the team name, I would have guessed this was a different team playing the Justice. I think they actually always haven't been that good at Sombra comps. I think they just don't have a very... I think a lot of the timing of when you should dive is based on the Sombra. Is based on, like, when you get a hack. The Sombra feeds you information about where people are positioned. I think the Sombra needs to be incredibly vocal and instructive in how the dives are set up. And for some reason, the Shock tend to struggle at those compositions. Yeah, I think that's part of the biggest reason. Which is weird, because Rascal is very vocal and a very smart player, but they don't get it done a lot of the time. Alright, so the Justice have managed to push themselves into the point using the Bob, which is huge as well, because the Bob also does take a lot of space here. Which is, I think, something that Hex and Jaws talk about a lot in their cast. Starlog, thank you for the 3 months. San Francisco Shock with a good barrier for the EMP afterwards. The Bob, though, I want to talk a little bit about the Bob as this series goes on, because you notice how I said that it is very difficult for the Washington Justice to push in through tight choke points because they have to have their squishier backline also go through the choke point. Or when you have a Bob, the Bob can just push in and make a lot of space for you because there's no shield for the Shock to play behind. There's no sleep for them to be able to take the Bob out. And Rascal might sometimes find it difficult to get a hack on the Bob as well because people can disrupt him by shooting him. The Bob can as well. So the Bob in itself is like a space creation tool, and that allows Decay and Jano to come in after the Bob and make that space for their backline. The EMP comes through here, though, and they don't really find anything apart from the kill onto Choyobin. It's very nice positioning from the Shock to mitigate that. Rascal, Mr. Master of All, isn't well versed on Sombra, which I never thought that would be a hero he'd not excel on. Rascal in the past has looked like a good Sombra as well. I mean, we're talking a long time ago at this point, but yeah. Anyway, at this point in the series, after 2 rounds of Oasis, I still thought that the Shock would probably easily win. Even on this first map. Because they were still doing a good job. Like, at the beginning of Oasis, the very beginning, the first few team fights, they were good at getting aggressive dives onto Aim God and Stitch. In this map, this round, sorry, they were pretty good at getting aggressive dives once the Washington Justice committed too far. So it seemed like they had, in some sense, cracked the code. You wait for the Washington Justice backline to commit into an area where they're vulnerable, and then you go for a very heavy dive into them. But then the next round is just terrible coordination again. Chromoris, thank you for the gifted sub. But also, this map itself is much more wide open. It's not really tight choke points. The map is a big, big circle. There are some small choke points, but you don't really have to go through them. Anyway, let's go forward.
That has been Rascal, Striker, and Smurf all the way in. And it's funny, they literally just walk past Zarya and Roadhog.
So, exactly the same thing happening again here. The Washington Justice running the exact same comp. The Shock running the exact same comp. The problem is, this map is... This round, this specific map, is much more open than Garden. And University, actually. So, when the Shock dive in, the Justice just back up. And there's no big choke point, it's just one big circle. So Shock can't really bait them through a choke point and then dive on them. They have to be proactive, and they just get pounded. Absolutely pounded. Like Smurf's dive here at the beginning, if we wind it back a bit, why does he dive at the start? There's no hack. They haven't tried to pressure the front line. They haven't taken any space. They are just going for a blind ass dive straight in, where they don't even know who they're diving onto. They have Rascal positioned behind. Like if we wind back right here, look, they have Rascal here, who's probably feeding this info to the rest of his team that they're there. But as they dive in, they just get coach gunned away, and they're just shit out of luck. The dive is useless. They haven't landed on anybody. They haven't done damage to anybody at the beginning. They haven't hacked anybody at the beginning. Hack goes out on Tuba halfway through after they already get the kill on Smurf. So, I mean, that is very poor from the Shock. Really trying to force it instead of playing with any kind of nuance or finesse. What is going on in my chat? You run the Moira here because you need to get deep into the enemy lines, and you don't want your Ana to be sat miles away in the back line trying to get sight lines on you for healing. Like you're playing an aggressive, hypermobile dive composition. You don't want a vulnerable player in your back line. You want it, like, the entire purpose of this comp is just a hold W into the enemy team. As for why they're not playing, like, the person in chat that's saying Violite is a top 10 Ana, we haven't seen Violet. We haven't seen Violet play enough Ana to be able to say where his Ana ranks. But the fact that they don't even run him, like the fact that they were going to run Architect at the beginning of the season and then they picked up Twilight to fill that gap in their team comps, indicates to me that he probably isn't. Who are they vulnerable to? In this composition, not very many people. But if Tuba runs the Tracer, or if Tuba runs the Pharah, or if they're playing against some other variation of this composition where you've got like a Diva or whatever, then you're very vulnerable to a bunch of people. Like, for example, some of the APAC teams are running the Hog with a ball as well, at which point you're very vulnerable to the ball. Jonak tried to run the Ana in this comp. Like, New York were running this comp, but with an Ana. And let me tell you, Jonak was being farmed because it's such an easy adaptation to just kill their main healer, and then the comp falls to pieces. You need a highly mobile main healer in this comp.
You saw Washington just kept backing up and backing up and backing up. Like, you can't dive on us if you can never get to us. You're just going to eat all the damage that our tanks do, and your tanks don't do from range. So they just kept playing it back. And so I think that the map actually...
And this map, this round, oh my god. I mean, Smurf just got melted there. Again, though, they're just trying to force it. They're just running into the Washington Justice without any kind of setup. No map control, no hack on anybody, just inting. When I say the purpose of this comp is a hold W, I don't mean it in a literal sense. It's hyperbole. You have to take some positioning before you set up the dive. You have to have some kind of hack target before you go on them. You have to force the Washington Justice into a bit of a bad position. Can't Shock counter a Pharah like Philly did with Gladiators? What? I'm not sure I understand your question. You have to describe the scenario in more detail. Counter with the Pharah? No. If you're going to run the Pharah... Okay, so if you're going to run the Pharah, it's a slow-paced composition. For starters, you're playing it into Stitch, who has sightlines all over the place. Secondly, your tanks are going to get their asses eaten, because you need to slow the game down long enough for your Pharah to be able to get value, and they'll just lose the slow fight to Decay and Janu. Bottom feeders. Yeah, that's what they would be. If you eat my ass, you're a bottom feeder, right? Macaroni in a pot. That's some wet-ass pussy. Hi. Did you come in to say anything particular, or just tell me I'm a bottom feeder?
I was just coming in to say hi, but then I opened the door and you were talking about eating ass.
I wasn't talking about eating ass. I was just using eating ass as a metaphor for them getting killed.
That was it. I was just saying hi.
Hi. Say a different line. I literally don't know any of the other lines of the song. It's just one of the lines of the song got stuck in my head, and it was macaroni in a pot, because it's based on that the Vine from ages ago. Yeah, this play from the San Francisco Shock as well. They just dive into a team that has all of their ults available and EMP them and just hope for the best. The Shock just run at them. Look at that. They just run at them. And they just get EMP'd. But Rascal used his own EMP as well. But they're playing so one-dimensionally in terms of, like, they just, as soon as they see the Washington Justice, they try and jump on them. There's no attempt to push them out of that small room. There's no attempt to get a good coordinated dive from Smurf or Rascal. There's no attempt to get Stitch off the high ground before they punish. They just run forwards. Philly ran the same comp as the Shock, and the Gladiators ran Kevster on Pharah, and they just burned the tank in the backline. I think the Gladiators were running... Was that on Numbani? Or am I getting my wires crossed here? The Pharah is very map dependent. The Pharah is super good on certain points of the map, certain points of various maps. But the idea of countering the Pharah is to just burst their tanks down. But the San Francisco Shock are trying to burst down their backline, as far as I can tell. They're not even trying to go for Decay and Chanu. It was on Li Zhang. I can't exactly remember then. Anyway, the Gladiators weren't good with this composition. The Washington Justice are, so. I wouldn't use the Gladiators as the gold standard for whether or not certain things can be countered. I mean, this is all just desperation from the Shock. So uncoordinated. Like, right at the beginning of this fight, they just group up, no hack, they just run in again. They just literally run in. They run in with a sound barrier, and they haven't even seen where the Washington Justice are positioned. And they just go for like a desperation Death Blossom into the backlines. This is such poor play from the Shock. And I think they're going to spend their week working on this Sombra Reaper. I think they should, anyway. I think that the San Francisco Shock looked really good at playing the Zen Mercy kind of stuff with Ants on the Ashe. And they looked pretty good at countering the Hog Zarya by mirroring it, at least when Super was in, not when Smurf was playing the Zarya. But this first map of Oasis was so one-dimensional in terms of how they played the Sombra comps. The Shock would get eaten alive by Shanghai, Ellipse Sombra would run rampant over them. The Shock would get eaten alive by Fusion right now. The Shock would get destroyed by Fusion in a Sombra Reaper mirror if they played like this. Destroyed. Anyway, let's go on to the next map, because I think more so than the Justice winning that first map, the Shock really lost it. Like, I think if you give the Shock another week to be able to prepare and they reach a decent level with their Sombra Reaper gameplay, they would be able to win that first map. It might be close. Well, it definitely would be close, but I think they would be able to win it if you, if the Shock elevated their gameplay to a level that we expect from the Shock. This King's Row was... I don't even really want to review this King's Row, because this was the Shock realizing... So, after the first map, they realized that their understanding of the Reaper Sombra composition was too poor to be able to counter the Washington Justice. They had come into this match with a hubris that they could easily dispatch Decay and Janu on the Zarya Hog tank line, and they were wrong. It was hubris. It is only hubris if I fail. Famous quote from who? That's right. That's right. The Worms from Worms Reloaded. Anybody in the chat that got that? Pat on the back. That's white. Yeah, I didn't mean that's white. Hubris is a very white thing, though, I think. Anyway, the Washington Justice are basically going to play similar kind of stuff again. But the Shock here have decided to play some very different stuff, because their counter comp for map 1 has failed completely, so they're going to go for radical changes and just mirror the comp. This is what the Shock kind of try and do quite a bit. If they don't understand the meta, they'll just try and mirror and beat you by being better than you. But Smurf Zarya, I don't even really want to review this map, because they just got shit slammed. They got shit slammed. This is what they did against Atlanta, and they won. Against Atlanta, they mirrored the compositions. They didn't play Smurf on the Zarya. When they played Smurf on the Zarya against Atlanta, they lost. So in a larger concept, yes, they did mirror what Atlanta were running, but in terms of the specifics, they didn't run this comp. And also, yeah, that's Atlanta. This Ashe Tracer version of the comp is really deadly against an Ana in the backline and against the Ana Mercy and the it's just a lot of consistent damage coming out from Tuba. So even though Rascal and the San Francisco Shock have better ult cycling, Tuba's putting down way more damage and just being there for the pressure onto Ants and Moth. So I think that the Justice have a great understanding of their comp and how the mirror for their comp works and how to beat it. Like, something else that they're really good at that I'm sure you'll see throughout this map is when Choyobin goes for hooks, they kill Choyobin or at least do like 70% of his health during the hook animation because they know that he can't dodge and he can't take a breather. So they use like the smallest window of opportunity, him throwing out a hook, to be able to obliterate him. Whereas Janu tends to hold on to his hooks for a long time. Smurf just playing way too passive on the Zarya, backing off the entire time. Tuba being able to harass the backline way more than the Rascal can. It's sick sleep dart from Aim God as well onto Rascal there to deny the EMP. And they're just getting boomed. Absolutely boomed. When did Tuba hit the Hyperbolic Time Chamber and learn Sombra and Tracer? I don't know, actually. It's a very good question. Stitch and Tuba have leveled up their gameplay in the offseason. Tuba's Pharah has always been good. But yeah, his Tracer and his Sombra haven't. So that is a big level up for the offseason. Hot take? KDG is the most underrated coach this season. He was criticized last year for his rotation of players in hero pools. It set Philly up for success. Sure, the roster is stacked, but a worse coach could easily mismanage it, resulting in a worse season. Such as defaulting to the perceived best players instead of the best players for the hero pool, benching Carpe and Fury. I'm not saying he's the best coach, but he's hardly been spoken about this season and is rarely talked about regarding their success. That's true. We do very rarely talk about KDG, but I think part of the reason why I personally don't talk about KDG that much is because in the tournaments that we had this year, in the May Melee, in the Summer Show... was it the Summer Showdown? Did they make the finals of the Summer Showdown? They're blending together in my head. Who won the Countdown Cup? Where did Philly place in the Countdown Cup? I can't remember. So, anyway, the biggest reason for me that I wasn't talking about him at the beginning and middle of the season is because Philly hadn't really played against any top teams in the first half of the season. They didn't get a chance to play against the San Francisco Shock. They played against Paris a few times, but they always went to map 5 against them. But for me, one of the big killers of the like KDG or the well-coached argument for Philly was how badly coached they looked in the May Melee. And definitely the second half of the season has been a fantastic positive arc for the Philadelphia Fusion and for their coaching style. I agree with every point that you've made. Benching Carpe at the right times, integrating Hisu and Ivy into the lineup really well, rotating between Fury and Poco so that you don't leave any of the good players on the bench anymore, that kind of stuff. They looked so horribly unprepared for the May Melee and that first game against the San Francisco Shock when they fought them in the regular season as well, that I kind of lost confidence in their ability to prep for games really well. But in the last 2 months of the regular season, their performance in the Summer Showdown, their performance in the Countdown Cup, their final game of the regular season against the San Francisco Shock, and now their performance in the playoffs, I definitely think like the last 2 months of the regular season have showcased not just great play, but yeah, great coaching and preparation as well. So I think that argument about like KDG being a really good coach didn't really hold up in the first half of the season. Like it didn't make too much sense. But in the second half of the season, I can definitely see where you're coming from. May need to change your stream title. Good point. Let's go for that one. Shock versus Justice review. Okay. Anyway, the Washington Justice are just rolling them right now. Choyobin's getting absolutely destroyed. Just a hook into a Bionade. And he gets rolled around. Washington, Jano just playing so much smarter with how he's positioned around the rest of his team. Tuba switch off the Sombra to Tracer? Because in the mirror matchup, the Tracer is really good at pressuring Moth and Ants in the backline. So Ants was playing the Ashe before this, but Tuba can just basically give his team an instant advantage by annoying Ants and Moth so that they're essentially taken out of the fight. Like, even if he doesn't kill them, if he just distracts them, the amount of damage coming out from the rest of the team is overwhelming. And even if Rascal gets a nice hack off onto Janu or Decay, the Shock don't have a fast tempo composition to really be able to punish that. Like, they can to some degree, but the hacks are much less useful. The EMP is still really huge, but Rascal threw it away, so we didn't even get to see that. Actually, Rascal didn't throw it away. Aim God hit a ridiculous sleep dart. It was also probably a bad timing for Rascal to use it, but you got to give the credit to Aim God on that one. Janu or Choi overall? Probably still Choi, but in this meta, Janu knows what he's doing a lot, because they've scrimmed it a lot more. Choi just gets destroyed. Smurf without a bubble for him once he gets hooked. The patience with the bubble timings from Decay is really good. And the patience with the hook timing as well from Janu is also really good. Bren was talking about this a lot on Plat Chat, and I totally agree with him. Oh, no, actually, it was Matt that was talking about this a lot on Plat Chat. Decay and Janu hold on to their abilities a lot to provide just the threat of the hook and the safety of the bubble. When is Plat Chat? Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Okay, again, I didn't really want to review this map in detail because the Shock just got rolled because they were trying to run a mirror comp and they didn't really know how to play it. So, but the next three maps are very interesting. Volskaya because it showcases a large weakness in the Justice's composition, and Gibraltar because it showcases a weird strength of the Hog Zarya on a map where you wouldn't expect them to be strong. Look at that. The first hook, look at this, all right? This is what I'm talking about. Hook comes out from Choyobin, and because he's more static after his hooks, it's a much easier hook for Janu to be able to get off. So it's always better to hook second, I think, in these kind of compositions. Because Choyobin, when he goes for his hook, is so vulnerable. Because he just stands there like, he's just static the entire time. So you can punish somebody when they go for those hooks. So Choyobin just uses it way too early, gets hooked into the rest of his team, gets bionated after the bubble has already been broken, and that's a win. Decay and Smurf now battling against each other, but the Tracer, again, from Tuba, able to provide more value than Rascal on the Sombra, who's much more static and can't really evasion tank, if you know what I mean. I think that's like a MMORPG term, but it's like when you're dodging around, so you're like taking shots from the enemy, but none of them are hitting you. Ants with a nice shot. Aim God's been picked here, though. So, Justice really don't have the healing to be able to win this, but the tanks have died, so the Shock really need to get that res off. Hey, Lush Bunny. No, I'm not going to show you the back of my head. Oh, last question. Sorry, Suede. Sorry, I absolutely Dono-walled you. Shock played Sombra Genji Dive against the Fusion in the Countdown Cup and somehow made Striker Ants on Sombra work. One of the reasons why you said they won that match was their teamwork. Do you think it's just Rascal on the Sombra that's messing up their teamwork? Maybe, because they did look better when they played against Atlanta with Ants on the Sombra. I don't know. I can't give you a exact reason why they look worse with Rascal on the Sombra, but they definitely don't look as clean with their teamwork or coordination. I mean, not on this map. This map is just a GG go next because they hadn't scrimmed this comp, presumably. Grav? Yeah, what did Smurf do with that Grav? Yeah. Very bad Grav. But again, this is Smurf. He's a main tank player. He's not a good Zarya player. I mean, he's not terrible, but he's not good enough to be able to go up against the best teams in the world. Sideshow, do you think Valiant will beat Justice? If they spend the entire week counter-comping the Justice and really figure out a good strat for beating them, it's possible, but it'll still be really close. It's either going to be a fairly simple win for the Justice or a very close win for the Valiant. So the odds are in favor of the Justice, I would say, but it is possible that the Valiant do it. They've got a good coaching staff. I wouldn't bet on it.
Want to do that at all. You can hide in this small health pack room as well. Rascal's still waiting for everybody to enter.
Hug comes out. EMP is actually good, though, from Rascal. Bionade comes out straight afterwards, but they don't kill Decay. The follow-up is just not there, because they're running the Widowmaker instead of the Ashe, so they don't have that consistent damage. And that's why I'm saying that the Sombra in the mirror is not as good as the Tracer, because even when you use EMP like that, the follow-up isn't really there, because you don't have a comp that just gets kills fast. It's a slow-paced composition. So the Sombra really is not that useful. The Sombra is good in the non-mirror, but the Sombra isn't as good in the mirror, in my opinion. I think the Ashe Tracer is better. Sometimes maybe you could get value out of the Pharah in the mirror, actually, as well. But I think most of the time, the Ashe Tracer is the best thing to run in the mirror with the Hog Zarya. What would be the score if the Justice played Shock again? I don't know. I think I would say something like... I think I would probably say something like 3-1 to the Shock, but it might still be a 3-2. And honestly, the Justice might clutch the win as well. There were some times in the last two maps, especially on control maps, it is very even. Even if the Shock know how to counter the Justice, it's still very possible for the Justice to win. Would Shock be far and away the best if Sinatraa could play the Zarya? Probably, yeah. Because they'd be able to play every comp at a... Well, actually, that still wouldn't help them play the Sombra Reaper comp, but they'd be able to play the Hog Zarya at an even higher level, and they'd be able to play the Zen Mercy backline with the Ashe kind of comp to a super high level. So... Probably, yes. I see Justice making it to the final the lower bracket final. It's hard for the Justice because they're going to be playing against teams that are trying to counter-strike them the entire way. They're going to be playing against the Valiant, who've spent a whole week trying to counter-strike them. They're going to be playing against the Mayhem, who are going to spend at least some time counter-striking them. They're going to be playing against maybe the Shock again in the lower bracket final too. It's very hard for the Justice to get to the grand finals, but it is possible. Look at this. EMP, the follow-up is just very meh. They get 2 picks out of it, but the spawners are going to come through. The kill on Arc is huge, actually, though. The Ant's pick on Arc is enormous. The Mayhem match will be interesting. Yeah. Could you give us preds for the rest of the bracket, having seen this week's games? Yeah, I actually did that already. I did that at the end of yesterday's stream, I think. Oh wait, no, I didn't, because I didn't give any preds for APAC, did I? Yeah, I'll give you guys some bracket preds if you like. In fact, I'll do it now because I don't really want to... I don't even want to watch the rest of King's Row because the rest of King's Row just played out the same way. I don't think there's anything analytically interesting for me to particularly talk about here because the Shock were playing a comp that they weren't particularly practiced on. Justice know exactly how to play the mirror. Rascal wasn't getting as much value against Tuber, and Stitches got more consistent damage over the team fight than Ants does on the Widowmaker, even though there's a bit more clutch potential. So I don't think there's really that much of value to go through on King's Row.